The history we were taught in school often sanitized the terror. We learned about segregation as if it were merely separate water fountains and different entrances to buildings. We heard about the Ku Klux Klan as if they were a fringe group of extremists operating in the shadows. But the truth cuts deeper than textbook summaries and polite historical distance. Between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, America operated under a system of racial apartheid so brutal, so systematically violent, and so comprehensively enforced that it shaped every aspect of black life in ways that still reverberate today. This wasn't just about laws on paper or social customs. This was about terrorism as public policy, murder as community entertainment, and the constant grinding fear that defined what it meant to be black in America. The crimes committed during the Jim Crow era weren't aberrations. They were features of a system designed to replace slavery with something almost as effective, a regime of terror so complete that it would keep black Americans in a state of permanent subjection. But within that darkness, there were also stories of resistance, courage, and an unbreakable determination to survive and ultimately triumph. This is the story of those crimes, that system, and the people who refused to be broken by it. The ash from the Reconstruction era had barely settled when white supremacists across the South began constructing the architecture of Jim Crow. They didn't wait for formal laws to be written. In towns and counties across the former Confederacy, white citizens took matters into their own hands with a methodical precision that revealed just how organized their resistance to black freedom truly was. In places like Wilmington, North Carolina, white residents literally overthrew the elected biracial government in 1898, murdering black citizens in the streets and forcing elected officials to flee for their lives. This wasn't spontaneous violence. It was a carefully planned coup d'etat, complete with manifestos published in newspapers and militia units coordinating their attacks. The message was unmistakable. Whatever the Constitution said, whatever rights black Americans had won through war and legislation, white Southerners would enforce their own law through violence and intimidation. The legal framework that followed merely codified what terrorism had already established. State legislatures across the South passed laws that seemed neutral on their face, but were designed with surgical precision to disenfranchise black voters while technically complying with the 15th Amendment. Literacy tests that required black applicants to interpret obscure passages of state constitutions, while white applicants were asked to write their names. Poll taxes set at levels that excluded sharecroppers earning dollars per month, while including exemptions for white voters whose grandfathers had voted before the war. These weren't simply unfair laws. They were legal Trojan horses, carrying the poison of white supremacy in constitutional clothing. Registrars wielded these tools with absolute discretion, failing black teachers and preachers while passing illiterate white farmers. The system was brilliant in its cruelty, creating plausible deniability for discrimination that was absolute in its effect. But the laws were only half the story. Behind every statute, every regulation, every seemingly bureaucratic obstacle stood the implicit threat of violence. Black men who insisted on their right to vote often found their homes burned, their families threatened, their livelihoods destroyed. In rural counties where black farmers outnumbered white residents, a single attempt to register to vote could result in economic devastation as white landowners, merchants, and bankers coordinated to drive the offender into destitution. This wasn't individual prejudice. It was systemic economic terrorism, enforced through networks of power that extended from the county courthouse to the general store to the bank. The genius of Jim Crow was that it made resistance almost impossible by ensuring that every aspect of economic and social life depended on black submission to white supremacy. 19-year-old Thomas Harper had worked the Johnson plantation outside Meridian, Mississippi, since he was old enough to walk behind a plow. The year was 1904, and Thomas had committed what local whites considered an unforgivable transgression. He had asked Mr. Johnson for his wages in cash rather than credit at the plantation store. It was a simple request. the kind any laborer might make. But in the inverted logic of Jim Crow Mississippi, it was an act of dangerous defiance. Thomas didn't understand the invisible rules that governed every interaction between black and white in the Delta. He didn't know that questioning the plantation economy, even politely, even reasonably, was stepping across a line that could cost him everything. When Mr. Johnson responded with a backhanded slap, telling Thomas to get back to work and be grateful for what he got, the young man made his second mistake. He stood his ground. The confrontation that followed was brief. Thomas didn't strike Mr. Johnson, didn't threaten him, didn't even raise his voice above a firm insistence that he had earned his pay and deserved to receive it. But he didn't back down. He didn't adopt the posture of submission that Jim Crow demanded. For white onlookers, this was intolerable. By nightfall, a group of 8 men had gathered at the general store in town, passing a bottle and working themselves into the righteous anger that white supremacy cultivated like a crop. They weren't strangers or outsiders. They were the sheriff's brother, the county clerk, 2 deacons from the Baptist church, and 4 farmers whose children went to the same schoolhouse. These were respectable men by the community's standards, and what they were planning was considered respectable work, teaching an uppity Negro his place. They found Thomas at his family's cabin just after midnight. His mother, Clara, tried to block the door, pleading that her son meant no disrespect, that he would apologize, that he was a good boy who worked hard and never caused trouble. They pushed past her like she was furniture. They dragged Thomas from his bed, still in his nightclothes, and tied his hands with the same rope they used for hauling cotton bales. What happened next in the woods outside Meridian was repeated in thousands of similar woods across thousands of similar towns. Thomas Harper's body was found 3 days later, hanging from a railroad trestle where every black person riding into town would see it. The coroner's report listed cause of death as unknown causes. No investigation was conducted. No arrests were made. The Johnson plantation found a new field hand within the week. The terror wasn't random. It was pedagogical. Every lynching was a lesson taught to the entire black community about the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries that white supremacy had drawn. The location of bodies, the timing of violence, the public nature of the spectacle, all of it was carefully calculated to maximize the psychological impact on black Americans. In towns across the South, lynchings often occurred on Saturdays when black families came to town for shopping and socializing. The message was unavoidable. This could happen to you, to your husband, to your son, to your father. One wrong word, one perceived slight, one moment of forgetting your place could end with your body displayed as a warning to others. The terrorism of Jim Crow wasn't about punishing individual crimes. It was about maintaining a system of control through collective fear. The Ku Klux Klan emerged as the unofficial enforcement arm of this system, though its membership was anything but secret in many communities. The men who rode at night in white robes were often the same men who sat in church pews on Sunday, who served on juries, who held positions in local government. In small southern towns, the Klan wasn't a shadowy conspiracy. It was the local power structure in costume. When Klan members burned crosses in black neighborhoods or whipped black men accused of economic success or social transgression, they did so with the certain knowledge that no law enforcement would intervene, no prosecutor would bring charges, no jury would convict. The Klan functioned as a terrorist organization operating with state sanction, sometimes explicit, but more often simply understood through deliberate inaction by officials who were themselves Klan members or sympathizers. The violence wasn't always spectacular. Much of it was grinding daily, almost mundane in its regularity. Black men forced off sidewalks when white people approached. Black women subjected to sexual harassment with no recourse to law or protection. Black children taught from their earliest years never to look white people in the eye, never to speak unless spoken to, never to forget that survival depended on constant vigilance and submission. This daily terrorism was perhaps more effective than the spectacular violence precisely because it was inescapable. You could avoid staying out late, avoid confrontations, avoid anything that might draw attention, and still find yourself subject to the random violence of white supremacy. A white man having a bad day could take it out on any black person in reach. A white woman's false accusation could result in death. The system was designed to ensure that no black person ever felt safe, ever felt secure, ever forgot their designated place in the racial hierarchy. Reverend Isaiah Washington had been preaching at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama, for 15 years when he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. It was the summer of 1922, and another young man from his congregation had been beaten nearly to death for allegedly not moving fast enough when a white supervisor gave him an order. The boy, 16-year-old Marcus Lee, would never walk properly again. As Reverend Washington sat with Marcus's mother in the colored section of the hospital, listening to her quiet sobs, something inside him crystallized. He had preached patience, had counseled his congregation to keep their heads down, to trust in the Lord's justice even when earthly justice was denied them. But sitting in that hospital, looking at a mother's grief, he understood that patience and prayer weren't enough. The following Sunday, Reverend Washington delivered a sermon that departed from his usual careful theology. He spoke about the biblical mandate for justice, about Moses confronting Pharaoh, about the prophets who challenged kings. He didn't call for violence or resistance in explicit terms. That would have been suicidal. But his message was clear. Submission to injustice was not a Christian virtue. After the service, several older members approached him with concern etched on their faces. They had lived through the worst of the violence, had seen what happened to black men who spoke too boldly. They loved their pastor, but they feared for him. Reverend Washington listened to their warnings with respect and gratitude. Then he told them he couldn't be silent anymore, that his soul wouldn't allow it. If that meant danger, he said, then he would face it with faith. Word of the sermon spread quickly through both the black and white communities. Within a week, Reverend Washington received his first visit from the Klan. They came during the day, which was unusual and somehow more threatening than a night visit. 5 men in ordinary clothes stood on his front porch and told him that his preaching was causing trouble, that he needed to remember his place and stick to scripture instead of getting political. The Reverend invited them to attend service next Sunday if they wanted to hear what he actually preached. The audacity of the invitation stunned them into silence for a moment before one of them stepped forward, close enough that Reverend Washington could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You keep pushing," the man said quietly, "and you won't live to preach another sermon." The Reverend met his eyes and said, "I've been dying my whole life in this place. At least let me live before I go." The economic dimension of Jim Crow was as brutal as the physical violence, though it operated with more bureaucratic precision. Southern states constructed legal frameworks that essentially recreated slavery through convict leasing and debt peonage. Black men could be arrested for vagrancy, defined as being unemployed or unable to prove employment at a moment's notice, and then leased to plantations, mines, and lumber camps where they worked in conditions that often resulted in death. The system was remarkably profitable for white landowners and industrialists who essentially received slave labor with legal sanction. In Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia, state revenues became dependent on leasing black convicts to private companies, creating a financial incentive for the mass incarceration of black men on trivial or fabricated charges. Sharecropping, the system that replaced slavery for many black families, was designed to trap farmers in permanent debt. Landowners provided seed, tools, and credit at the plantation store, keeping the accounts themselves with no independent oversight. At harvest time, black farmers would discover that after all debts were settled, they actually owed the landowner money, making it impossible to leave without being accused of theft or fraud. 30-year-old Samuel Brooks learned this the hard way in 1915 when he tried to move his family from a plantation in Georgia to Birmingham, where jobs in the steel mills promised actual wages. The sheriff arrested him at the train station for stealing the debt he owed his former landlord. Samuel spent the the next 2 years in a convict labor camp, while his wife and children nearly starved trying to survive without him. When he finally returned home, broken in health and spirit, the family was deeper in debt than before. But Black Americans weren't passive victims of economic exploitation. They created parallel economies, built their own banks and insurance companies, established businesses that served their communities, and generated wealth despite the obstacles. In cities like Durham, North Carolina, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black business districts thrived, creating pockets of prosperity that demonstrated what was possible when Black talent and labor weren't stolen by white supremacy. The success of these communities, however, often provoked violent white backlash. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where white mobs destroyed the Greenwood district known as Black Wall Street, demonstrated the terrifying reality that Black economic success could trigger genocidal violence. The message was clear. Black Americans could be exploited for their labor, but they would not be allowed to accumulate wealth or achieve independence from white economic control. 23-year-old Rebecca Thornton walked the dirt road from the colored school where she taught to the boarding house where she rented a room. It was October 1928, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pine trees that lined the road outside Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Rebecca had graduated from Tougaloo College with honors, one of the few Black women in her county with a teaching certificate, and she took her work seriously. She taught reading, arithmetic, history, and something else that the white school board didn't know about. She taught her students about Frederick Douglass, about Harriet Tubman, about the Black soldiers who fought in the Civil War. She taught them that they were descendants of people who had survived the Middle Passage, who had endured slavery, who had earned freedom through their own courage and sacrifice. She taught them to be proud. One of Rebecca's students, 10-year-old James Crawford, had made the mistake of correcting a white boy at the general store when the boy claimed that colored people had never invented anything. James, remembering Miss Thornton's lessons, had mentioned Granville Woods and his contributions to railroad technology. The white boy had run home to his father, a deputy sheriff, claiming that a colored boy had called him ignorant. By the time Deputy Crawford found James, the story had grown in the telling. Witnesses who were never there swore the boy had been disrespectful, had pushed the white child, had acted uppity. The deputy beat James with his belt right there in the street, a public humiliation designed to remind every Black person watching what happened to those who forgot their place. But James's mother, Ernestine, wasn't prepared to let it go. She knew who had put those ideas in her son's head, knew that Miss Thornton's teaching, as much as she appreciated it, had painted a target on James's back. That evening, Ernestine appeared at Rebecca's boarding house, not to complain but to warn. Other parents were worried too. The white school board had heard about the incident. There would be consequences, perhaps a visit from the Klan, perhaps worse. Rebecca listened to Ernestine's warning, thanked her for the concern, and told her something that the older woman would remember for the rest of her life. If teaching the truth is dangerous, then I'll be in danger, but I won't teach lies. Our children deserve to know who they are. Ernestine, who had survived the violence of Jim Crow by keeping her head down and her mouth shut, looked at this young teacher with a mixture of admiration and terror. She recognized courage when she saw it, and she knew how often courage was punished in Mississippi. The assault on Black education was systematic and deliberate. Southern states spent wildly disproportionate amounts on white schools compared to Black schools, often at ratios of 10 or 15 to 1. Black schools operated in churches, shacks, and abandoned buildings, using hand-me-down textbooks from white schools, taught by underpaid teachers who often had to work second jobs to survive. The school year for Black children was shortened to accommodate the planting and harvest seasons, ensuring that education would never interfere with the need for Black labor in the fields. This wasn't neglect, it was policy. White supremacists understood that education was dangerous, that literacy and learning could inspire Black Americans to question the system that oppressed them. Keeping Black children ignorant was essential to maintaining the social order. Yet Black communities valued education with an intensity that reflected their understanding of its transformative power. Parents who could barely read themselves made enormous sacrifices to keep their children in school. Teachers like Rebecca Thornton worked for poverty wages, knowing they were targets because they believed in the sacred mission of education. Churches raised money to extend school buildings, buy books, pay teachers. In rural areas, traveling teachers would move from community to community, holding classes wherever they could find space, teaching adults at night and children during the day. This commitment to education, despite overwhelming obstacles, represented one of the most powerful forms of resistance to Jim Crow. White supremacists wanted to keep Black Americans ignorant and dependent. Black communities insisted on literacy, learning, and intellectual development as pathways to freedom. The danger faced by Black teachers was real and constant. They were monitored by white authorities, reported on by informants, threatened when their teaching strayed into anything that might challenge the racial order. In rural areas, teachers often boarded with local families, moving from home to spread the risk that came with harboring someone who might be targeted. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, teaching became one of the most respected professions in Black communities. A teacher was someone who had achieved education themselves and was now passing that precious gift to the next generation. They were more than instructors. They were symbols of possibility, living proof that Black intellectual capacity was equal to anyone's, despite what the laws and customs of Jim Crow insisted. That's why they were dangerous. That's why Rebecca Thornton found 4 men waiting outside her boarding house on a cold November night. The violence against Rebecca Thornton wasn't spontaneous. It was authorized by the interconnected power structures that enforced Jim Crow. The school board had complained to the sheriff. The sheriff had mentioned it to his deputies. The deputies had talked to their friends in the Klan. Within that network of white supremacy, Rebecca's fate was sealed before she even knew she was in danger. They didn't come in robes this time. 4 men in ordinary clothes, one of them, the deputy whose son had been disrespected by James Crawford, arrived at her boarding house and demanded she come outside. The elderly woman who ran the boarding house, a widow named Mrs. Foster, tried to say Rebecca wasn't there. They pushed past her and dragged Rebecca from her room. What they did to her in those woods outside Hattiesburg was meant to destroy more than her body. They wanted to break her spirit, to make an example so terrifying that no other Black teacher would dare to teach pride or history or anything beyond the basic subservience that white supremacy demanded. They whipped her with the same methodical precision that overseers had used on enslaved people, counting out lashes while telling her this was what happened to uppity colored women who didn't know their place. They told her to leave Mississippi and never come back, that if she stayed, she'd end up like so many others who had challenged white authority. Then they left her there, bleeding and broken, to find her own way back if she could. It was a miracle she survived. It was a greater miracle that she didn't leave. Rebecca Thornton spent 2 weeks recovering in Mrs. Foster's boarding house, tended by women from the community who brought food, changed bandages, and prayed over her battered body. During those weeks, something hardened in her that would never soften again. She had been afraid before they came for her. She had known the danger intellectually, but now she had experienced the full weight of white supremacy's violence, and she had survived it. When she was finally able to stand, to walk, to think clearly again, she made her decision. She would stay in Mississippi. She would go back to teaching, and she would teach the truth with even more determination than before. Her students needed to know that the terror they lived under wasn't natural, wasn't right, wasn't permanent. They needed to know their history, their strength, their value. If Rebecca Thornton had to risk her life to give them that knowledge, then that was the price she would pay. The legal system under Jim Crow was designed to deliver injustice with the appearance of due process. All white juries, white judges, white prosecutors, and court-appointed defense attorneys who barely pretended to defend their Black clients created a machinery that turned out predetermined verdicts with assembly line efficiency. A Black man accused of a crime against a white person had essentially no chance of acquittal regardless of evidence. Meanwhile, white men who murdered black victims were acquitted with such regularity that trials became formalities, performative exercises in a justice system that wasn't designed to deliver justice. The courtrooms themselves were segregated, with black spectators forced into cramped balconies or standing areas, physically demonstrating their subordinate status even as their fates were being decided. 29-year-old Robert Hayes sat in a Mississippi courtroom in 1933, charged with assaulting a white woman based on testimony that was transparently false. The alleged victim admitted she had never seen her attacker's face. The crime had occurred at night, more than a mile from where Robert had been working in full view of a dozen witnesses. But Robert was black. The victim was white. And in the logic of Jim Crow, that was all the evidence required. His court-appointed attorney, a young white lawyer who showed up drunk to the trial, offered no defense, called no witnesses, made no objections. The jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. The judge sentenced Robert to 15 years in the state penitentiary, which in Mississippi meant convict labor camps, where black prisoners died from overwork, disease, and violence at rates that shocked even contemporary observers. But Robert Hayes never made it to the penitentiary. 2 nights after his sentencing, as he sat in the county jail awaiting transfer, a mob broke in and dragged him from his cell. The sheriff, who had somehow neglected to lock the jail's outer door that night, was conveniently absent. What happened to Robert in the hours that followed was typical of the lynchings that plagued the South. Torture meant to extract a confession. Degradation meant to reinforce white supremacy's message about black humanity, and finally murder by hanging from the bridge where his body would be discovered by black farmers heading to work the next morning. The coroner ruled it suicide. The newspapers, in the rare instances they mentioned such events, described Robert as a dangerous criminal who got what he deserved. His mother, his wife, his children were left with grief and terror, but no recourse, no justice, no acknowledgement that a terrible crime had been committed against them. The migration of black Americans from the South to northern cities represented both an escape from Jim Crow and a testimony to how unbearable life under that system had become. Between 1916 and 1970, 6 million black Americans left the South in what historians call the Great Migration, seeking freedom, opportunity, and basic human dignity in cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. For those who left, it was both a liberation and a profound loss. They were escaping the daily terrorism of Jim Crow, the constant threat of violence, the grinding economic exploitation, but they were also leaving behind family, community, churches, land that their ancestors had worked for generations. The decision to migrate was rarely easy, often heartbreaking, and always tinged with the bitter knowledge that they were being driven from their homes by a system of oppression that should never have existed. 35-year-old Josephine Williams stood on the platform at the Montgomery train station in August 1941, her 3 children clutching her skirts, 2 battered suitcases containing everything they owned sitting at her feet. Her husband, Thomas, had left 6 months earlier to find work in Detroit's auto factories, sending money back so Josephine could follow once he got established. She had lived her entire life in Alabama, had buried her parents in the cemetery outside Selma, had friends and cousins, and church family woven into every part of her existence. Leaving felt like tearing herself in half, but staying meant raising her children under Jim Crow, meant watching her sons grow up in a world that could kill them for any perceived transgression, meant her daughter facing the sexual violence that white men inflicted on black women with impunity. When the train pulled into the station, Josephine picked up her suitcases and herded her children aboard, not looking back because if she did, she might not have the strength to go. The journey north was itself a passage through the geography of American racism. As the train crossed from Alabama into Tennessee, from Tennessee into Kentucky, from Kentucky into Ohio, Josephine felt the invisible borders of different regimes of oppression. In the South, segregation was law, violence was public, and everyone knew the rules because they were written in statutes and enforced with terror. In the North, discrimination was supposedly illegal, but functioned through customs, economic barriers, and residential segregation that was just as effective at keeping Black Americans confined to specific neighborhoods and excluded from specific opportunities. Josephine didn't harbor illusions that Detroit would be paradise, but at least her sons wouldn't be lynched for looking at a white woman. At least her daughter could walk down the street without the constant harassment that Jim Crow made routine. At least there was hope, however tenuous, that hard work might actually lead to something better rather than just perpetual debt and subordination. The Second World War created a crisis for American white supremacy. Black soldiers fought and died for a country that denied them basic rights, and they came home determined not to accept Jim Crow after having fought fascism abroad. Veterans like Medgar Evers and Hosea Williams returned from the war radicalized by the contradiction between the freedom they fought for overseas and the oppression they faced at home. These men had led troops, made life or death decisions, proven their courage and capability in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They weren't about to shuffle and bow to white authority after surviving combat against the Nazis. Their determination to claim full citizenship rights, backed by the organizational skills and discipline they learned in the military, represented a new and dangerous threat to the Jim Crow order. Sergeant Isaac Turner came home to Biloxi, Mississippi in 1946, wearing his uniform and his medals, expecting that his service would earn him at least basic respect. He had landed at Normandy, fought through France and Germany, seen friends die in his arms. On his second day back, he went to the courthouse to register to vote, believing that his military service had earned him that right regardless of what Mississippi law said. The registrar, a middle-aged white man who had spent the war selling insurance, looked at Isaac's uniform with undisguised contempt. "We don't register coloreds here, boy," he said, using the diminutive that was meant to put Isaac back in his place. "I don't care how many medals you got. This is Mississippi, and you best remember that." Isaac Turner should have backed down. Every survival instinct honed by living under Jim Crow told him to apologize, to leave, to accept the humiliation and live to fight another day. But something in him, hardened by combat and emboldened by having faced death already, refused to submit. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice steady. "I bled for this country. I'm registering to vote." The registrar's face went red, then white. He picked up his telephone and made a call. Within an hour, Isaac was in jail on charges of threatening a public official and disorderly conduct. Within a week, he was dead in his cell from what the sheriff claimed was suicide by hanging, though Isaac's family noted that his hands had been beaten so badly he couldn't have tied a rope. His death was meant to send a message to other black veterans: your service means nothing here, your courage will be punished, and the only acceptable role for a black man is submission to white authority. The resistance to Jim Crow didn't begin with the Montgomery bus boycott or the March on Washington. It was constant, daily, unglamorous, and often invisible to history. Black Americans resisted through economic organization, through education, through religious community, through the simple act of maintaining their dignity and humanity in a system designed to crush both. They created institutions, schools, churches, fraternal organizations, newspapers that existed parallel to white society and provided spaces where black humanity was recognized and celebrated. They passed down stories, taught their children history that wasn't in textbooks, maintained cultural traditions that white supremacy tried to erase. This everyday resistance was less dramatic than the protests that would come in the 1950s and 1960s, but it was essential to survival and to maintaining the possibility of future freedom. 42-year-old Reverend Marcus Green ran a small church in rural Louisiana that served as more than a place of worship. It was a school where adults learned to read, a meeting hall where farmers discussed strategies for collective bargaining, a sanctuary where people could speak freely about the injustices they suffered. Reverend Green preached the gospel, but he also preached dignity, self-respect, and the conviction that God made all people equal, regardless of what Louisiana law said. He was careful, never openly calling for defiance of Jim Crow, always maintaining plausible deniability that he was just preaching Christian values. But everyone who attended his church understood the subversive nature of his message. Teaching black people to read was dangerous. Teaching them to organize was more dangerous still. Teaching them that they were equal in God's eyes undermined the entire theological justification for white supremacy. The white authorities couldn't quite figure out how to shut down Reverend Green's church. He wasn't breaking any laws they could prove. He paid his taxes, didn't cause public disturbances, and always adopted a posture of deference when dealing with white officials. But they knew he was dangerous, knew that the ideas he was spreading would eventually translate into challenges to the racial order. They threatened him periodically, tried to get his congregation to turn against him, pressured the landowner who rented him the building where his church met. Reverend Green absorbed the pressure and continued his work, understanding that resistance under Jim Crow meant playing a long game, planting seeds that might not bear fruit for years or decades. He taught children who would become the protesters of the civil rights movement. He built networks that would support boycotts and voter registration drives. He kept hope alive in a time and place where hope was a revolutionary act. The sexual violence inflicted on black women under Jim Crow was systematic and largely unpunished. White men raped black women with the certain knowledge that no legal consequences would follow, that their victims had no recourse to justice, that the entire apparatus of law, enforcement and the courts would protect them. This violence served multiple purposes in the white supremacist system. It was a weapon of terror, an assertion of white male power, and a means of reinforcing the absolute vulnerability of black women in a society that denied them protection or dignity. The stories of these assaults were often whispered, passed between women as warnings, rarely documented because doing so only brought more danger without any possibility of justice. 26-year-old Dorothy Mitchell worked as a domestic servant in the home of a prominent white family in Charleston, South Carolina. The work was exhausting and poorly paid, but it was steady employment, and Dorothy sent most of her wages home to her mother and younger siblings in the country. The eldest son of the family, home from college for the summer, had been watching Dorothy for weeks with a predatory attention that made her skin crawl. She tried to avoid being alone in rooms with him, tried to time her work for when his mother was home, tried everything she could to protect herself without losing the job her family depended on. But one afternoon, when the rest of the family was out, he cornered her in the upstairs hallway and forced himself on her while she pleaded for him to stop. When it was over, he threatened that if she told anyone, he would have her arrested for theft and her family thrown off the land they sharecropped. Dorothy Mitchell faced an impossible choice. She could report the rape, which would result in her being dismissed from her job, likely arrested on fabricated charges, and possibly killed by a mob if the young man claimed she had seduced him. Or she could stay silent, continue working in that house, and live with the knowledge that her rapist could assault her again whenever he chose. She chose silence because it was the only choice that allowed her to survive and keep supporting her family. That silence was enforced by the entire structure of Jim Crow, laws that made it nearly impossible to prosecute white men for crimes against black women, economic systems that made black women dependent on white employers, and a culture that treated black women's bodies as available for white male use. Dorothy's trauma was individual, but the system that enabled it was collective. Her silence wasn't consent. It was survival under a regime that gave her no other options. The legal challenges to Jim Crow began decades before Brown versus Board of Education. Black lawyers, working through organizations like the NAACP, filed lawsuit after lawsuit challenging segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination. They won important victories in cases like Missouri, XRL Gaines versus Canada, and Sweat versus Painter, which chipped away at the separate but equal doctrine. These legal battles required extraordinary courage from the lawyers, plaintiffs, and witnesses who who participated, taking Jim Crow to court meant putting your name on documents that would mark you as a troublemaker, potentially cost you your job, and possibly result in violence against you and your family. The lawyers who argued these cases often did so while receiving death threats and working under conditions that would have made most contemporary attorneys quit in despair. Attorney Thurgood Marshall traveled through the South in the 1940s and early 1950s, staying in black homes because no hotel would accommodate him, eating at black restaurants because white establishments wouldn't serve him, and arguing cases in courtrooms where judges and juries made clear their contempt for everything he represented. He investigated lynchings, defended black men accused of crimes they didn't commit, and built the legal strategy that would eventually culminate in the Brown decision. Marshall understood that every case was dangerous, that Southern white supremacists saw legal challenges to segregation as acts of war. He carried a gun when traveling through rural areas, received armed protection from local black communities, and made his will before every trip south because he knew the risks were real and immediate. The people who agreed to be plaintiffs in these cases showed even greater courage because they couldn't leave when the case was over. When the NAACP needed plaintiffs to challenge school segregation, they were asking parents to put their children's names on lawsuits that would make them targets. They were asking people who might lose their jobs, their homes, their safety for a legal victory that might not come for years and might not help them personally even if it succeeded. Yet people stepped forward, understanding that the fight for freedom required sacrifice, that progress demanded courage, that someone had to be willing to take the risks even when success wasn't guaranteed. Linda Brown's parents in Topeka, Kansas, didn't know that. Their daughter's name would become synonymous with the fight against segregation. They just knew that their child deserved better than the segregated school system offered, and they were willing to fight for that right, regardless of the personal cost. By the mid-1950s, the combination of legal victories, demographic changes from the Great Migration, international pressure during the Cold War, and mounting resistance from black communities made Jim Crow increasingly untenable. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated that black economic power could force change when properly organized. The Brown decision, though resisted violently across the South, declared that legal segregation was unconstitutional. Young people, energized by these victories and determined to accelerate change, began sitting in at lunch counters, riding buses to challenge segregation, registering voters despite violent opposition. The civil rights movement that emerged in this period didn't create resistance to Jim Crow. It channeled and amplified resistance that had always existed, giving it new forms and new visibility that white America could no longer ignore. But the end of legal segregation didn't mean the end of white supremacy's legacy. The economic devastation, the educational deficits, the trauma, the stolen wealth, the destroyed communities, all of that survived even after the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act passed. The system of terror that had governed black life for nearly a century left scars that wouldn't heal in a generation. Families that had been denied the chance to accumulate wealth during the decades when white families built equity through home ownership and business ownership started the post-segregation era economically crippled. Children who had been educated in grossly underfunded schools were competing in job markets where their credentials were worth less than those of white peers. Communities that had been deliberately destabilized by violence and oppression struggled to rebuild trust and cohesion. The crimes of Jim Crow weren't just historical wrongs that ended when laws changed. They were structural violence that shaped the landscape of American inequality in ways that persist today. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling on past injustices. It's about recognizing that the present is built on that past, that the disparities we see in wealth, education, health, and justice didn't emerge from nowhere, but were constructed through deliberate policy and systematic terror. The courage of those who resisted who survived, who maintained their humanity and dignity through the darkest years of American racism, is a testament to human resilience. Their stories deserve to be told not as tales of victimization, but as chronicles of resistance, of people who refused to accept the degradation that white supremacy demanded and who ultimately, through their collective struggle, began the long process of dismantling the system that oppressed them. The work they started continues today, carried forward by those who understand that justice requires not just legal equality, but the repair of centuries of deliberate harm.